Okay, to respect everyone's time, we'll go ahead and start. The good thing is this will be recorded, so hopefully people can watch it after. So good evening and welcome everyone, or all that is able to join us tonight. This is the first of a series of ranked choice voting information session. My name is Ann Sue. I'm the city clerk for the city of Albany. I'm also the election official for the city's local election. I have with me tonight the deputy city clerk, John Klaus, and Grace Ramsey from Democracy Rising. Democracy Rising is a nonprofit organization that the city retained to help with ranked choice voting outreach and education. They have worked with many different jurisdictions on ranked choice voting with voter education and candidate training. Before I turn the virtual session over, I want to share with everyone that the session is being recorded and is live streamed to YouTube. The recorded video will be available on City's YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/Albany KALB, and also the city's ranked choice voting webpage, which is www.albanyca.org/RCV. If there are any questions tonight, you can submit them through the Q&A function with Zoom webinar. And after the session, please email questions to cityclerk@albanyca.org. And now I'll turn it over to Democracy Rising. Grace, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm assuming we may have some more folks join as we go along. So I'm glad this is being recorded. I know that this is early in the evening for most of you. However, for me, I'm on the East Coast, so it's a bit late here. So thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, a little bit about me. I've been educating voters about ranked choice voting for 10 years now. I first learned about ranked choice voting at all in Minneapolis, where I went to college, and the city was implementing ranked choice voting for the first time in a competitive election in 2013. And I worked on a citywide voter education campaign. So nothing about candidates, nothing about whether we like or dislike the system. It was just about educating voters and making sure that they were prepared. And ever since, I've enjoyed talking to voters, candidates, everybody who's involved in elections to make sure everybody's brought along in these processes. And as Ann said, I've worked in a lot of places across the country, from Maine to Alaska, to the Bay Area in the past, to Portland, Oregon this year, a lot of different places, as this reform has been adopted in a lot of different places. So what I'm hoping to give you all today is some of the best practices I've picked up along the way. We're going to cover a lot of the basics of what ranked choice voting is and how it works. And then for those who may be considering running for office, I know that your application period for candidates is starting very soon. And so we wanted to provide some information as well about how ranked choice voting changes the experience for candidates, because oftentimes candidates are the folks who are talking to the most voters about ranked choice voting. So we really want to make sure that everyone's informed. So with that, I'm going to dive into my presentation. I will be checking the Q&A as much as we can, so feel free to send questions in real time, and I'll answer them if I can. And if I don't, I'll make sure that I get to all of them at the end. And I think, yeah, we should be able to move through this pretty quickly. So I don't know that we'll need the whole time, but we'll do our best. And especially if there's a lot of questions, you have all of my time and I will answer as many as I can. So we'll stay until folks really feel like they have asked the questions that they need to. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. All right. Anne, can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the full slide and not the presenter view? Wonderful. All right, so we can skip right over this. So we're going to start talking about what ranked choice voting is and how it works. You may hear me switch back and forth between saying ranked choice voting and RCV. All RCV is an abbreviation, so we're not talking about different things, but I realize it may sound a little bit different. So let's talk about the Albany context to start. So Albany passed ranked choice voting by a ballot measure in 2020. It was passed by over 70% of the voters and then was used for the first time a couple years ago. So you all have done this before, but I realize, especially in a presidential election year, there may be a lot of voters who have not heard of this before or have not voted in an election with ranked choice voting before. So we really want to make sure that everybody's coming along and that we are kind of redoubling our efforts on education. Also, there is never a bad time to do voter education or to engage voters. And so we are going to have a series of presentations for folks and make sure that we can get that information out into the community. But for anybody who this may be a new concept for, this is a change to your voting system that was passed by the voters, and it is your second time doing it. So it's an old habit by now, I'm sure, for many. Additionally, ranked choice voting is used across the United States. Forms of ranked choice voting are used in other countries as well, but we're just going to focus on the US now. So it's used in over 40 cities across the country. Those are those pink dots that you're seeing. It's used in 2 states statewide, that is Alaska and Maine, so up in those corners. And then there's a lot of other kinds of uses of ranked choice voting that we see in various places. So in some places where they have runoff elections, like the states down in the South that you see that sort of band there, they use ranked choice ballots for their military and overseas voters to make sure that they can fully participate in a runoff without having to send back an additional ballot. There's also use in party elections in various places and in special elections in other places. So lots of different uses of this. And all of that is to say, this is something that we've really developed best practices about. There are other folks across the country doing this. You all are maybe changing things about your local democracy, but you are using best practices from other places and you are in good hands. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned. So that is the other places where ranked choice voting is being used. You can see your dot in California there. So have been in the mix for a little while here. All right, so what is ranked choice voting? So this is similar to what a ballot may look like. It may look a little bit different to this. Obviously, your candidates will not be foods that we want to eat for lunch, but that's what we're going to use for our example today. And so when you're looking at a ranked choice ballot, you're going to work your way from left to right. So you can see that column there on the left that has our lunch options. Those are going to be your candidates. So you're going to look at that list on the left. You're going to scroll down that list and you're going to find your favorite candidate. That's your first step. Who is your favorite? Considering how I'm feeling today, pizza is going to be my favorite candidate. So what you do is, starting on the left with your favorite candidate, you move to the right. And I'm going to mark pizza as my first choice. Then we look at our list of candidates again, find who's our next best candidate, who's our next favorite candidate, and you mark them as your second choice. You're going to mark one candidate per choice. So one first choice, one second choice, one third choice, and so on. And the way I like to think about it is how we have it here on the left, is your first choice is the candidate you love. That is maybe somebody who you have their yard sign in your yard. Maybe they're your neighbors, so you really know that you can talk to them about all of your issues. Whatever it may be, whoever is your favorite, whatever reason they are, that's your first choice. Now, let's say for some reason, though, that first choice has to drop out of the election for some reason or another. You probably still want to have a say in who gets elected. And so that's where those backup choices come into play. So second, third, fourth, and so on, those are your backup choices in case your favorite candidate isn't in the race anymore. So first choice candidate you love, second choice candidate you like, third choice candidate you like slightly less, and then the fourth choice, I sometimes say candidate you can stand, however you want to frame it. But as many choices as you want to rank on that ballot. You can rank as many or as few as you like. If there is one candidate that you like and you don't like anybody else, it is okay to just rank that candidate and leave the rest blank. But remember, those second, third, and so on are just backups in case that candidate is no longer in the race. So this is what your ballot's going to look like. And we'll reiterate, you're going to mark one choice per column. So one first choice, one second choice. You do not have to use all of your rankings. And ranking another candidate, so ranking a second or a third choice, does not hurt your favorite candidate. I think that's one of the most common questions that we get is, does it hurt? And you're going to hear me say that a couple of times through this process of no, ranking those backup choices does not hurt your favorite candidate's chance of winning. So largely for voters, this is where we kind of stop our presentation, because this is what voters need to do, is just rank candidates honestly in order of choice. But what we're going to do today is we're also going to talk about how we count the votes, how we figure out our winners. So we're going to start there. So the first thing we need to know is how many votes does a candidate need to win? So with ranked choice voting, the number of votes a candidate needs to win is determined by the number of seats that you're electing. So if you're electing one seat, a candidate needs more than half of the votes to win. Why is that, you might ask? Because that's the fewest amount of votes that one candidate can get that two candidates can't, right? If two candidates have more than half of the votes, something has gone terribly wrong and we have too many votes accounted for. So that's how we figure out our winner. And that keeps going with how many seats we're electing. So for instance, this year, we're electing 3 seats for city council. And so when we're electing 3 seats, we have to figure out what is the fewest number of votes that ensures you can't be beaten in this race. And that is 25% plus 1 or more than a quarter of the votes, because only 3 people can get more than a quarter of the vote, right? If we have 4 people that have more than a quarter, we have too many votes and something has gone wrong. So that's how we figure out the winner, is who can get more than a quarter of the vote and which 3 candidates are able to do that. So let's take a look at how it may look on election night or when we're counting these votes. All right, so voters ranked their ballots, and we start by only looking at voters' first choices. Only voters' first choices. And something like this may happen, right? Where we have several candidates and actually 3 of them have more than a quarter of the vote, more than 25%, and we have our winners and we're all done, right? That could happen. That's a realistic thing that can happen in these elections. We're going to get into another example because a lot of times if there's several candidates and several strong candidates, that may not be how it goes. But if this were to happen on election night where 3 candidates have enough votes that more than 25% and they're able to be elected, then we're all done. We never had to look into backup choices, none of that. We just have our winners. But as I said, that may not be how it goes on election night. So let's look at an example where that's not the case. So in this situation, we have our 5 candidates and we actually have one really, really popular candidate. They have more than 25% of the vote. I'm talking about candidate A, and they have enough votes to be elected. So they have one of our seats. They are a winner. But there's a really large amount of the voters, a really large portion of the voters who are supporting candidate A. And in a ranked choice voting election, when we're electing more than one seat, we really want to make sure that all voters are getting representation in proportion to how much support they have in the electorate, right? So a lot of voters felt similarly about candidate A. In fact, enough voters that we may want to see if they have a say in another seat as well. We don't want to punish a candidate or a group of voters for liking a popular candidate. And so what we do is each voter who supported candidate A would have a small portion of their vote go to their next choice. And I'm going to go into what that means in a minute. We'll see what it looks like, and then I'll break it down a little bit more. So what we do is the votes that are over the threshold, more than they need, we divide amongst all of the voters who supported candidate A, and they each have a little portion of their vote go to their next choice. The way I think about this is, if my vote is $1 and I have $1 to spend to elect a candidate, and candidate A was so popular, they only needed 90 cents of my dollar to be elected, I get to spend that 10 cents on my next favorite candidate. So here we can see some of those voters like candidate C, some of those voters liked candidate D, and some like candidate E. It did not elect another candidate, but it definitely helped support another candidate. So we see where those voters' preferences lie. But I'm going to go a little bit further into how that works and what I was describing with that portion of your vote. So let's say that candidate A has 60 votes and they have 15 more votes than they needed to win. So we see that gray line there. They have 15 more. The numbers aren't going to match up exactly with the circles, so don't stress out about it. But what we do is we take those 15 votes, extra votes that they have, and we divide it amongst those 60 total voters, which means the voters who supported candidate A would then have a quarter of their vote go to their next choice, right? So that's how the math of it all works. It's a little bit more involved than we usually would go, but that's how the process works of making sure that voters are getting that representation. And just because there's a lot of them who have this opinion, we don't want to limit them to a say on one candidate when there's enough of them that they could have some say on another candidate being elected. So here's how we figure out that portion of the vote that goes to the next candidate. Just wanted to break that out so folks had a little bit more time with it, and I'm sure there'll be questions, so we can go back a little bit later. So we're going to continue with our election. So candidate A is elected. Those voters have that small portion of their vote go to their next choice. And now we look and see if we have any other candidates with enough votes to win. And the answer presently is no. We do not have another candidate who is over that 25%. So what we do is we eliminate the candidate with the fewest votes. In this situation, that would be candidate D. You can see candidates B, C, and E have more votes than candidate D, and candidate A is already elected. So this may mean that candidate D was a very single issue candidate. This may mean a lot of different things. It does not mean that candidate D is a bad candidate by any means. It means that they just didn't have enough support to continue on in this race as we're finding our three winners. So we eliminate the candidate in last place, candidate D, and those voters would instantly have their vote go to their backup choice on their ballot. So their next choice that they marked on their ballot, that's where their vote is going to go. And we can see here that puts candidate B over the line, and candidate B has enough votes to be elected. In fact, candidate B has more votes than they need to be elected. So we have two of our three winners, and we repeat that same process that we did with candidate A, where those extra votes are divided amongst all of candidate B's voters. And we see that small portion of their vote would go to their next choice. Oh, wait, I went backwards. Sorry. So that small portion from candidate B's voters is enough. Candidate C was right at the line. And so the surplus is what we call that. The surplus votes being divided amongst candidate B's voters, and that small portion of their vote going to their next choice put candidate C over the line, and we have all three of our winners. So to summarize the process, we start by only looking at voters' first choices. If a candidate has more than enough votes to be elected, they win one of the seats. And if they have a surplus of votes, we divide that amongst all their voters, and they have a portion of their vote go to their next choice. That's why a lot of people call this proportional ranked choice voting, because voters win representation in proportion to their strength in the electorate. Then if no one has enough votes to be elected, we eliminate the candidate with the fewest votes, and voters who selected that candidate would have their vote instantly go to their next choice. We repeat that process until we have our three winners. I'm going to check and see if we have anything in the Q&A. I'm not seeing anything for now. Please flag me down, Anne, if we do. But if not, I'm going to keep going into some of the frequently asked questions that we get. It may sound familiar because I want to make sure that I'm saying it a couple times in the presentation, but we're going to go through it nonetheless.
We do have a few questions from when people register, but we can wait till it's a good stop. Great.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I have a
stop.
little ways to go with the sort of 101, and I think we'll stop then and answer those questions. That sounds perfect. All right. Okay. So how many candidates do I rank, and do I have to use every ranking? I know I've said this a couple times already, but I think this is where it can feel different from other elections, and I really want to make sure that we're clear about this. You can rank as many or as few candidates as you want. That is totally up to you as a voter. We are not going to force you to rank any candidates that you don't like. So if there is a candidate that you truly could not stomach filling in an oval for, don't fill in the oval. But for the most part, using those rankings as they are intended, where your first choice is the candidate you really support and the rest are backups, is really important to remember as you're doing this. And you are electing more than one seat, right? So making sure that you're showing your opinions amongst all the candidates and who may win all of those three seats is important with those rankings. So it is in your interest to use those rankings, but you are certainly not required to by any stretch of the imagination. All right, so here is a way that you could fill out your ballot. And it is something that we don't see often, but occasionally we do see. Whereas this voter really, really wanted to have a burger for lunch. And so they ranked burger for all of their choices on their ballot. Most of the time, in fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say all of the time, if you vote this way, it is going to count for burger. That is not an error if you are hoping to cast your vote for burger. But the key thing here is making sure that voters understand filling out your ballot this way is the same as ranking burger as a first choice and leaving the rest blank. Because as I said, those second, third, and beyond choices are just backups in case your favorite candidate is out of the race. So let's say I was going to a restaurant and I wanted to order, and they said, "Hey, what can we get for you?" And I said, "I'll have the burger." And they said, "I'm so sorry, we don't have that today. It's not possible." If I'm using my ballot to make my decision, I don't have a backup choice on here, right? So the chances of me getting lunch went down if I only had one choice and only marked that. So when you're filling out your ballot, again, this is okay, but we always want to make sure voters understand the choices that they're making. And so ranking your ballot this way is exactly the same as ranking burger as a first choice and leaving the rest blank. And you're choosing not to have a backup choice if burger is out of the race. All right, does it hurt my favorite candidate to rank second, third, and so on choices on my ballot? And the simple answer is no. I think a lot of times in our politics, we feel very torn between options, and that is one of the things that ranked choice voting tries to eliminate, is that feeling of, ooh, but if I do this, I might end up electing the person I don't like. That sort of voting calculus is just not going to exist in a ranked choice election. Your backup choices will only be counted if your first choice is eliminated or if they're already elected, right? And you get to have a say on one of the other seats being elected. So it is not a betrayal of your favorite candidate to rank backup choices. It just means that you still have a say even if they are not in the race. All right, so this voter really likes just a number of lunch options. And they chose to rank 3 of them as their first choice. And you may have heard me say before, you can only mark 1 candidate per column. I have immense respect for election administrators, and they have a very hard job. And one thing they can't do is read your mind. And so making it really clear what you intend on the ballot is essential, because we don't know who this voter's first choice is. So this vote cannot be counted for any of the first choices that were marked, right? We can't determine what voters meant and how it was going to work. So one thing we really want to avoid is marking more than one candidate. And it's the same, it would work in any election, right? If you were voting for US Congress or something like that, and you mark 2 candidates, that's called an overvote, and that's called an overvote here. And so we can't guess what you meant, so we have to ignore that choice, and that can't factor in. So the main thing to remember is 1 candidate per column. All right, I'm going to pause here, and then we can do some of those questions, and then I'm going to go into how to talk about ranked choice voting.
Okay, I think some of them you may have already answered in your presentation, but I'm just going to read off the questions. The first one says, can I vote for the same person in various ranking? Second one says, how does Albany's voting tally work? And
Knock those
the
2 out
third,
pretty well.
yeah, those 2 are pretty much answered. The last one, what opportunities and challenges do you foresee for counties who are transitioning towards ranked choice voting?
If it was 10 years ago, I would say that it was a bit of a challenge. Now it's pretty easy to do. I believe California uses Dominion systems for all of their voting systems, and Dominion has great ways of doing ranked choice voting. I think largely it's just adjusting for the voters. I think and the candidates, to be honest, it's an adjustment for both. But for cities or counties that are moving to ranked choice voting, there are great resources out there. There are tons of best practices you can lean on. I will shout out an organization I've worked with quite a bit called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, which are former election administrators who offer insights and best practices and even like support in implementing ranked choice voting. So a lot of the things that 10 years ago were difficult really aren't anymore, just because as more and more cities, counties, and states start using this, the path has become much more trodden and therefore easier to traverse. So yeah, I think there's a lot of answers out there, but there's a lot of people that are here to help for places that are doing that.
And Grace, I also have a question on your previous slide where you mark 3 first choices and 1 second, 1 third, 1 fourth. I
Mhm.
understand if there are multiple bubbles filled in for the same ranking, that ballot cannot count. But since they also mark for the second, third, and fourth, would their second, third, and fourth be counted?
So this varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but my understanding in most places that have passed ranked choice voting more recently is we would ignore that first choice where there was the overvote and move to those next choices, but you would have to consult your or like your specific language around that. So for instance, I'm working in Portland this year, who is also electing 3 city council members with ranked choice voting, so a very similar process. And for them, they would ignore the overvote and then move on to those backup choices. But it differs from place to place. So I don't want to make a definitive judgment on Albany, but I can certainly get an answer to that question.
Great.
Awesome. All right. Well, then we'll go through sort of how to talk about ranked choice voting and then dive into the candidate portion of this. And then I'll be checking for questions throughout. But we didn't have anything in the sort of Q&A there, right? I didn't see anything pop up.
No.
Okay, great. All right. I will go back to sharing my screen. All right, so this section is how to talk about ranked choice voting. I think that a lot of times for folks who are either, if you're joining us just as an interested voter who is going to talk to their friends and neighbors about the election this year, if you're here as someone who is considering running for office, whatever that may be, it can be something that takes a little getting used to talking about ranked choice voting. And so what I've done is I've put together some of my best practices, my tips, the things that have worked well for me and how to talk about it. And so I'm going to run through those quickly. The main thing is that it is okay if someone doesn't know what it is, if someone doesn't like it, if somebody loves it, anything like that is okay. When we are talking to voters and trying to educate them about the system, their opinions of it are, we respect them, we honor them, but we are not trying to influence them in any direction. We really just want to make sure they have the information that they need to vote effectively in this election. So the first thing is sometimes someone will get a little bogged down in theoreticals. So that may be an election that happened 24 years ago where they wonder if we had ranked choice voting, what would have happened then? It could be an election in a few months from now, and they wonder what would happen if we had ranked choice voting in that event. There's a good rule of thumb that I've heard from a lot of my friends who are more in the political science world, and that is when you change the way that people are elected and the way that voters are casting their ballots, you change everything about an election. So while there are guesses that we can make, we can't say anything with certainty about theoretical elections and how they would have gone. And so I, to the best of my ability, avoid getting bogged down in sort of hypothetical scenarios. Because we're focused on the election at hand and we're making sure that everyone knows how to vote in this year's city elections in Albany. And outside of that, you catch me at the right day at the right dinner table, and I'll talk about this till I'm blue in the face. But if I'm focused on educating voters, my focus is, do you understand what your ballot's going to look like? Do you understand how you're going to use it? And are you prepared to vote this year, right? And so getting into those conversations can be fun as a sport, but definitely not when we're doing our job as educating voters and making sure that they know how to vote in general. And if you're a candidate, how to vote for you. And so avoiding that is a good tip. The next is avoiding jargon. I already said it. I'll say it again. I have immense respect for people who run elections, but the language that they have to use to do so is usually guided by the law itself, which is not written for someone at my reading level a lot of the time. So it can be really technical and it can feel a little overwhelming to folks. And so I recommend avoiding jargon as much as you can. And you might say, what does that mean? The rule I have for myself is if I had to learn a word to do this job that I'm doing now and to learn about ranked choice voting, I avoid using it when I'm talking just in public and with folks who may not be as familiar, because my goal is to make everyone feel like every election is for them. And sometimes language that feels inaccessible can make someone feel like voting isn't for them. And it's always our goal to bring people in and not make them feel excluded. So an example of when there could be jargon and when we wouldn't use it. So let's say I'm going through the counting process and I say the candidate in last place is eliminated and the voters who cast their ballots as that candidate as a first choice would have their vote reallocated to their second choice. So that's a sentence that makes sense in some places. But there are a few things in there that I just typically don't say in my day-to-day life. One of them being reallocated. That's not a word I use very often. And so when I talk about this, I say the candidate in last place is eliminated, and voters who rank that candidate first instantly have their vote go to their next choice. So I recommend just trying to find those spaces. On campaigns, this can be particularly something to watch for with really amazing volunteers, but sometimes a volunteer will get really into the policy itself and forget that the goal of voter education is to educate the voter, not show off your knowledge. And so we always want to make sure we're meeting people where they're at and bringing them along rather than make them feel like they need to play catch up. In a very similar vein, keep it simple. There are people who may really want to go in the weeds and get really into the concept. That's totally fine if we have the time. But if I'm having a brief conversation with a voter, I want to remember the key things I need them to know, which is we're going to be using ranked choice voting this November, right, for our city elections. And then I'm going to remind them that in ranked choice voting, instead of just picking one candidate, they're able to rank them. And if I'm in person, I'm going to either pull it up on my phone or somehow show them what a ballot's going to look like. Those are my goals, is to make sure that they're familiar with the ballot and they understand how it's going to work. If I have more time, I'm happy to go through how votes are counted with somebody and do a little bit more of that. But largely, if you're presenting to a group, if you're talking to a large group of people, if you're tabling at a community event, all of those things, you're really limited on the time you have with people. So when it comes to voter education, you want to keep it really simple and get them the information that they need. Next, bringing it back to the voters and their values. Sometimes the change in elections feels like the thing that matters, and we have to bring it back to what we're really talking about. So, if an election is a conversation, we're just having that conversation a little bit differently than we used to. So if you are talking to a voter and it's feeling like, oh, but this ranked choice voting, that's totally fine. They don't have to like this. That's all well and good. But what we really want to focus on is why we're having this conversation to begin with, which is there is an election, which is going to put people into office who are going to make really important decisions about our city. And so we want to make sure that your voice is heard in that process. And so we're going to make sure that you have all the information that you need to cast your ballot effectively, right? Bringing it back to why we're doing this and what our values are. We value having our voice heard. We value participation, all of those things, but bringing it back to that so that we can kind of take the temperature down a little bit on the change itself if it's feeling like it's going in that direction. The last thing is we rank things all the time in our lives. And this is just a different application of that. So oftentimes what I recommend is taking it out of politics to bring it back in. A lot of times with voters, when I encounter frustration, it's often a lack of confidence, really, is what I'm seeing, of I don't know what to do, where I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And so when that happens, I like to give examples of real life where you may make a decision like this. A really simple one that you may have heard before is somebody says, if you are going to the store and you really want some ice cream, but they're out of your favorite flavor, you're just going to pick your next favorite flavor, right? That's a ranked choice decision. If I can't have my first choice, here's my backup choice, and so on. That's one way of thinking about it. But there's also higher stakes decisions that we make this way all the time. So I like to think about it in my niece is a junior in high school and has to start making some decisions about her future. She could go to a 4-year school. She could go to culinary school because she's a great cook. She could go right into the workforce, or she could attempt to take a gap year. I don't see that happening for her, but good luck to her if she wants to go that route. But those are 4 choices that she has in front of her, and she has to decide what's her ideal. What is the thing that she most wants, and what will it take to get that, right? What if she can't have that? What if for some reason maybe she's not feeling well on the day of the SAT and doesn't do as well as she hoped to, or maybe, the program that she really wanted to go to is full for the year already and she didn't know, or whatever it may be. But having that ideal choice and that backup choice and the backup to the backup choice, that is a really normal thought process, and it's a high stakes one, but it is involving ranked choice thinking. And so I like to take people into the parts of their lives where they've made these choices. If anybody has ever had a big family like I do, making any decision involves some level of ranked choice thinking. So taking it out of politics to bring it back in. So recognizing that we use this thought process, we've all done it before, and then saying, okay, well, we're just applying that to our elections this year. I find that often can kind of just reassure folks that this is not something that they are unequipped to do. It's just a different application. And finally, show, don't tell. I think ranked mock elections, seeing a ranked choice ballot is usually the most important way that voters learn about these things and that they have their sort of aha moment. So have people show them a ballot if you can. There's all kinds of online platforms like rankedvote.co is a great one that I've used before. But mock elections are a great way to do the voter education with it being a feature of whatever conversation you're having and not the focus of it. So let's say you're a candidate and you're having a big fundraiser at a local pizza shop. Well, you could do a mock election of the different kinds of pizzas and see who are your, 3 pizza city councilors. And you can do an election like that. And then when you're giving your speech at the end as a candidate, you can say, hey, these are the winners of our pizza competition. By the way, this is how you're going to vote in the elections this fall. I hope you rank me as your first choice. This is called ranked choice voting. You've already done it. You're all ready to go, right? So it's not the focus of your event. It's a feature of your event. And it's a really good way to get the voter education done without necessarily having to sidetrack from anything else that you may need to say or ideas that you want to get out there. So always having some sort of interaction with the ballot is the best way to get voters, and it's the easiest for all of us. It involves the least amount of talking. It's easy to get tongue-tied sometimes when talking about the sort of ins and outs, so I really, really recommend using the ballot, using mock elections and things like that to really lead the way with voter education. So now we're going to get into talking about how ranked choice voting impacts campaigns themselves. This is so largely, I mean, if you're just someone who's interested, that you're more than welcome to stay. This is open to everybody. But for the most part, our audience now are folks that are planning on running for office. And we're going to talk about some of the best practices that we've seen from other places and lessons learned along the way and how ranked choice voting actually changes the way campaigns function. It's not completely earth-shattering and going to change everything, but there are some slight to medium changes that you'll see, and we really want to make sure to highlight those so that anybody who's considering running for office bears that in mind as they're filing their paperwork and bears that in mind throughout their campaign. So first, we're going to talk about building a winning coalition. Coalition gets used a lot with ranked choice voting in other places, and sometimes it's about candidates supporting each other. That's great. That's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about coalitions of voters. So in any campaign, no matter what, you have to figure out how many voters you think are going to turn out, and that helps you determine how many votes you're going to need to be elected. So what you want to do is determine how many folks you think are going to show up. So you want to use the average of 3 or more similar past elections. Similar is underlined because using the 2022 election probably isn't going to give you as accurate of a picture as the 2020 election with, everything on the ballot from president all the way down. That could really increase turnout. So we want to make sure that the elections that you're using are really similar to the one you're going to be running in. So let's say in our hypothetical city, we have 12,000 registered voters. We expect about 40% turnout, maybe a bit higher in a presidential year, but we're going to guess 40%, and that's 4,800 voters that you're expecting. So things to take into account here. As I said, hot or dead races above or below you on the ticket. Are there really big things that are driving folks to the ballot? Are there any ballot initiatives that people are really into? I know California has never, ever had a shortage of ballot initiatives, so there's probably a lot of those. Are there a lot of folks getting registered? Are there more voters in the process than there were at another time? I know that a lot of places changing to vote by mail has changed a lot of that just because folks don't have to leave on election day from work to go and cast their vote or anything like that. So and then, any new ballot access laws that may come up. So you want to factor all of those in, but by and large, it's using turnout and then factoring in those changes to make your best guess at how many folks you think are going to turn out. From there, you need to figure out the number of votes you need to get to be elected. So a couple years ago, there were 2 seats to be elected. That's why that's in yellow. But this year, we're talking about 3 seats to be elected. So as we said before, in a ranked choice voting election, if you're electing 3 members of your city council, they're going to need more than 25% to be elected, more than a quarter of the vote. And so then we need to figure out how many votes that is. I promise this is the last time I'm going to mention math, I think. All right, so if we're electing 3 seats and you need more than a quarter of the vote, what you're going to do is you're going to take the number of voters you think are going to turn out, so that 4,800, and you divide it by 4, and then you add 1. So you have more than 25%. So that's going to be 1,201 votes. Now, as we all know, campaigns are an interesting time of year. Something always goes wrong. Something's always different than you expected. And so you always want to build in a cushion. So here we'll say as an example, you're going to do 28% to make sure you're well and truly over the number of votes that you need to win. And here that'd be a little more than 1,300, right? So that's how you're going to figure out your win number, or how many votes you need to be elected, is how many voters do we think are showing up? What are the things that we think are driving voters to the polls? And then how many of those voters do we need in that election to get you over that 25% plus one? So a couple general things to remember are that in a ranked choice voting election, a successful candidate needs to have a large number of first choices. I know sometimes with those backup choices, it can seem like somebody can win by being everyone's second choice. And I'm unfortunately going to tell you that's typically not how it's going to work. As we remember, when no candidate had enough votes to be elected, we eliminated the candidate in last place. If you're everyone's second choice, it's pretty likely you're that candidate in last place, right? And so you do need to have a strong number of first choices. There needs to be people who want you to be running and are supporting you. And then the second thing you're going to need is, depending on the number of candidates, you're going to need those backup choices, unless you're sure you are well and truly over that 25% line. You're going to need additional choices from voters to make sure that you're building your support as you go. So the two questions you need to ask yourself are, how do I maximize my first choices? How do I get as many first choice votes as possible? And then the second question is, how can I be the second or third choice, et cetera, of people who are going to rank other candidates as a first choice? How can I maximize the amount of support that I get? So no matter how this election goes, I know I've built the support to get me over that threshold and ensure that I'm one of those candidates who has one of those 3 seats. So in thinking about it, this is a little bit different from elections, how we're used to them, and how maybe other elections may feel on your ballot, but not your city council ones, because we're using ranked choice voting. In other kinds of elections, it's a little us versus them, right? There's my base of support, there's someone else's base of support, and really we're fighting for those undecided folks in the middle. That's often the tenor that we see. So if I'm running a campaign, I know my base is going to vote for me. I just keep them happy, ask them for donations, do all of those things. I know this other person's base is not going to vote for me. So I'm going to persuade those folks in the middle that that other side is really bad and you shouldn't side with them. I'm going to dissuade that other side from even voting at all if I can. And I'm going to fight for that 20% in the middle and hope they come my way. That's how it can seem at times in politics, or sometimes the incentives function that way. Ranked choice voting is different. And I would encourage you to think of it like these concentric circles, these circles that build out. So the darkest circle in the middle there are your first choice voters. You really hope that's enough to get you elected, period, and you don't have to go beyond that. But if you don't have 25% plus one in that dark blue circle, what you need to think about is that next circle out is, how can I expand the voters who are going to support me, even if it's not as a first choice? How do I build out that support? And you keep building out that support to the second choice voters, to the third choice voters, until you have enough votes and you know that come election night, you are going to secure one of those seats. So that's how you want to approach it, is maximizing that dark blue circle and then building outward. And if you were thinking about it, we'll get into this much more, but if those second choice voters, people who are supporting another candidate, if you're out there saying your candidate's bad, you shouldn't vote for them, the chance of getting a second choice, of being their second choice, goes down, right? So that changes some of those incentives in terms of how candidates interact, in terms of how voters interact, and in terms of how our campaign season functions a lot of times. So now we're going to get into some very, very basic, very high level sort of campaign brass tacks and some of the things you'll be thinking about. These are all, again, just advice, but it's stuff we've seen from other places, so we wanted to be sure to include it. But it's things that you are going to do in a campaign, whether it's ranked choice voting or not. But we want to talk about how ranked choice voting will factor into that process. So baseline is, campaigns have 3 resources: people, time, and money, the most valuable of which is time. It's the only one you can't get more of. And so thinking through really clearly how ranked choice voting is going to impact all 3 of those, and how to use the time most effectively in a ranked choice voting election. So first, it's about knowing your competition. In other kinds of elections, this can be called opposition research. That's not what I would call it in a ranked choice voting election. I honestly call it cohort research most of the time. But getting a real clear understanding on what issues are driving your campaigns. Why are you in the race? What is the issue that you really think that you stand out? Where does the field of candidates align on your big issues? Where do you align on the other big issues in the campaign? Who do you find common ground with? Where do you find common ground? And where do you really think you stand out? But getting a sense of like, what are the driving factors here and where do you fit into the field largely? Do you need to take up more space on a certain issue? Do you need to distinguish yourself on a certain issue? Whatever it may be, but what is driving the election? And then from there, thinking about ranked choice voting itself. So who will be elected or eliminated? What order? Is there a very, very clear frontrunner, somebody who's going to perform really well? How do those voters feel about you as a candidate? Will they rank you as a second choice? If there's a lot of them, that can be immensely helpful. Where do you align with candidates who are either going to be eliminated, so you are hoping their voters rank you as a second choice? Where do you align? Where do you differ? What are the issues that you can talk to voters about and say, hey, I recognize I'm not your first choice candidate, but the candidate you're supporting and I agree on X, Y, and Z, and so I really think I should be your second choice. But that research on the issues and the field as itself, and then the research on how you think the race is going to go, informs you on where you may want to be reaching out and which voters are primed potentially to rank you as a second choice. So then you go into targeting and your outreach to voters themselves. So this is how we prioritize conversations. This is how we maximize time and people often in our research or in our resources from our campaigns of how are we going to have conversations with voters or reach voters so that we can get them to either vote for us as a first choice, but if it's ranked choice voting, how do we ensure that we get at least a ranking from them? And so with ranked choice voting, I recommend using the kind of first choice, second choice, third choice with your prioritization as well of thinking through, okay, we have to maximize our first choices. Once we feel we've done that, what is the next layer of support that we're looking for? Who are we looking for that support from? And working your way through that. And so this is the scale that I use for targeting. Most campaigns use a 5-point scale, and I've added a 6th point because ranked choice voting changes this a lot. So usually in a campaign, if you're using 5 points, so that's 1 being strong support, 2 being leaning support, 3 undecided, 4 leaning towards another candidate, and 5 voting for another candidate. If there is a 4 or a 5, you are going to spend very little time on them in another kind of campaign. In ranked choice voting, they are incredibly important. So our 1s and 2s are largely very similar. They are leaning towards supporting us, so we shore up that support, and then we push them up the ladder of engagement. We want volunteers. We want to make sure they turn out to vote. We definitely want to educate them about ranked choice voting so they know how to vote and how to cast their ballot. But that stays pretty much the same. For an undecided voter, we're definitely going to go towards persuasion. You definitely always want to never leave a first choice on the table if you don't have to, but also you have freedom in that conversation to say, you know, here are the reasons I think I should be your first choice. Now, I know you're going to hear from other candidates. And so, you know, if for some reason I'm not, I want you to know we're using ranked choice voting. So if I'm not your first choice, I would appreciate your second choice, right? And the same goes for a voter that is leaning or supporting another candidate, is you can say, hey, I totally understand these are the issues that I really align with that candidate on, and I think I'm really strong. So I would love it if you supported me as a first choice. But if you're not going to, I really think because of those issues I just laid out, I should definitely be your second choice. So it's a different kind of persuasion, but you're still having a conversation with a voter. Now, in a typical campaign, you would really not have many of these conversations with a voter who's leaning or supporting another candidate, right? It just doesn't serve your interests. Whereas with ranked choice voting, it really does, especially if you're elected. If it takes, you know, a certain number of second choices for you to be elected, knowing what got you there is really important for how you govern and how you deliver for folks who put you in office. The last one is 6, and that is a voter who may just oppose you, and that is hurtful, and that is a bummer, but it does happen. You know, we don't have strong opinions that we want to step up and lead our communities without some people maybe disagreeing with us or not liking it. And so that is the only situation where I would say remove that person from your list and probably don't reach out again. I don't think you're going to get a ranking, but this is how I would view voters and the direction that I would suggest communication goes in to make sure that you're maximizing your conversation with potential constituents. I think a really big key that we forget sometimes when we're candidates or campaigning is that it's actually your first act as an elected official. And so systems like this give you the opportunity to talk to as many of your potential constituents as possible. And so maximizing those, maximizing the voter education in them, encouraging people to turn out to vote is a great way to start off your potential time in office, but also maximizes your chance to win that seat and be in office. Finally, there are a lot of ways that technology comes into play. I don't have a particular, it doesn't matter whether you're using something really, really high tech like the Voter Activation Network or Nation Builder, or if you are using a spreadsheet on your computer with no formulas, or if you're using a pen and paper. There are all different ways. The old adage from field organizing is if you don't track it, it didn't happen. So however you are tracking, I hope you are in your campaigns. But whether you are using high tech, low tech, whatever you're doing, I've seen incredible work done in all of these capacities. Some of the most impressive tracking I've ever seen actually was done with a pen and paper and no technology whatsoever. So I'm not biased there, but however you're doing it. Ranked choice voting needs to be factored into your tracking because that is how you prioritize your outreach. So if you've had a conversation, if you've been talking to tons of voters on the doors and getting a ton of information, understanding which candidates, whether they're supporting you, whether they're leaning towards supporting you, if they're supporting another candidate, particularly that, gives you a ton of information when it comes time to expand beyond just your first choices, just your base. So if you've been talking to folks at community festivals and you're keeping track of which candidates they're supporting, you've done that research, you know what issues are out there, then you know who you think is going to be eliminated in what order in the race or elected in what order. You can then think, okay, candidate D is the candidate I think is going to be eliminated. I know that candidate D and I have, 3 issues that we're super similar on. And I know that we've tracked all the voters we've talked to who are supporting candidate D. So I'm going to call all those folks and ask for their second choice this weekend, right? So keeping track of what you know about voters' preferences allows you to speak to them more effectively and really give consideration to the ranked choice voting aspect of this. It's not entirely, again, it does not rely on technology. Technology can sometimes speed that up, but it is totally possible to track those things. Now, voters won't always outright say what candidate they're supporting, but oftentimes you can get a fair amount of information on where you want to follow up and who you want to follow up with. So the more you can track and the more you can track with ranked choice voting in mind, the better you'll be able to use your time and resources. The last thing we're going to talk about is messaging and how voter education and ranked choice voting can really help your campaign message effectively to make sure that not only are you asking voters to vote for you, but you're doing it in a way that you make sure that they know how to do so with ranked choice voting. So any effective field strategy incorporates ranked choice voting into your outreach. As I said, if you're going to be reaching out to voters in sort of a tiered way where you want to make sure you have your first choices and then you're going to talk to your second choice voters. If somebody is supporting another candidate and says, what are you talking about second choice? You need to be able to explain ranked choice voting to them so that they know they have the option to do so. And so incorporating that into the basics of your campaign is a really good way to ensure that voters are going to get as much information as they need to support you in some form or fashion. And you all are the front line on this for everybody. So in some ways, we appreciate the work that you're doing because being a candidate and talking to voters is the best way to get voters to show up to an election. But there are other folks who will be doing this too. So there are other resources out there and you do not have to be an expert on this to do it effectively. There are other experts around, there are websites, there are all of that. But oftentimes candidates are the ones having the direct conversations and you can point folks to resources if you're not feeling entirely comfortably, but we really want to support that and make sure that you are giving accurate information to the people that you want to represent. So one thing that we recommend is training everybody who's involved with your campaign in the basics of RCV. They do not have to do what I just did and give a 40-minute presentation on how it works and tips for how to talk about it. That is not what we're asking. We just want them to have the basics. So very basic level, what is a ballot going to look like? How does it work? And then point them to resources. So, if somebody, a good example is you could put an image of a ballot on your literature. And so your volunteer who's canvassing at a door can say your ballot's going to look like this, rank us as a first choice, and then rank so on whoever else you want to as your backup choices. But having that and then saying, if you want to learn more, you can go to Albany's website. That's going to tell you how that works. Or this is a fun video that we found with, sticky notes, whatever it may be. But there's a lot of different resources available to you that describe the process. And so the main thing for your volunteers they need to know is very basic, what ranked choice voting is, what races it's going to be used in this year. I think that may be a pretty big distinction for folks, as well as being really clear that this is for city elections, not anything else on the ballot. We're not changing that for, Senate or anything like that. This is for the city. And then as much as you can, show them what a ballot looks like. Answer questions as you feel comfortable, but also recognize you do not have to know the answer to every question, and then point people to resources for questions that you don't feel able to answer. So another thing with the ranked choice education is asking for lower rankings all the time and whenever you can. So that may sound a little complicated. So I'm going to show you some examples of other candidates in real world who have done this. So here's a few different examples of ways to do this. I'll go from left to right. So obviously this is from San Francisco, and the ask at the bottom is vote London Breed for number 1, 2, or 3. So if I'm a voter who doesn't know what ranked choice voting is, number 1, 2, or 3 is my hint that something is different about our election, right? That it's not like other elections that I've seen, because what would that mean, right? And so just an indicator that there is a system being used where you can rank them, or that there's different ways that you can do it. Include that fancy endorsement, whatever you need to do. But this is an effective message, even though it doesn't center ranked choice voting by any means. Then we have the one on the right that says rank Monica Z number 1 for mayor. Again, that's saying, hey, vote for me. It doesn't even factor in those backups, but what it does is it says rank. And that implies that there's a different system being used. So you tip off voters to ranked choice voting being used, again, without it being the central part of your campaign. Now, I would say this one in the middle is probably it's pretty far in the weeds on describing ranked choice voting, but really effective. I will say this candidate was in pretty much a dead heat between themselves and 2 other candidates. And so I think they knew that they really, really needed to get second choices from other candidates' supporters to win. So they said, I appreciate your first choice. And then underneath it says, if not your first choice, I would be honored to have your second choice. Then listed 3 kind of campaign core messages and got out of there. Spoiler, it did work. This candidate did win, and ranked choice voting was very involved in the process. So however you're doing it, acknowledging the process is really essential to making sure that you're both educating voters and they know how to vote for you, but also that you're maximizing the conversation with voters by letting them know, even if you are not their first choice, you would still appreciate being ranked on their ballot. Next, and very briefly, endorsements can be really different. So organizations that make endorsements, some don't adapt as quickly and don't make ranked endorsements, but they can. And I will say a couple of these, for instance, the top one, the Nurses Association of New York State, those candidates were very different on a lot of policies, but they both were really good on healthcare. And that was an interesting thing, even for the candidates, to find common ground on that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're endorsing the other candidate if you both get a ranked endorsement from the same organization. But if you see an organization that you think should be supporting you and they are not ranking their endorsements, and you know that they can, maybe do a little voter education there and say, hey, by the way, it's a ranked choice voting election. Why wouldn't you rank your endorsements? I think I should be your second choice. So that's another way that you can be messaging this out there. The last thing we're going to talk about is the risks of going negative in ranked choice voting campaigns. I want to be super clear when I say this, that it doesn't mean it won't happen. I'm not suggesting that ranked choice voting completely solves any negativity in campaigning. I do think it changes incentives, though, and I want to highlight those. So as I said before, if you are going to need the supporters of other candidates to rank you as one of their backup choices to win, telling them to vote against other candidates, specifically the one they're supporting, is a losing strategy. So what I recommend doing in the rule of thumb is distinguish, don't disparage. And so it is okay to step forward and say that what makes you different as a candidate. You wouldn't be running for office if you didn't think that you had a vision for your city that is different from other people's, and something that you have things you want to get done, you have things that you want to do for your city. So really distinguish yourself on those. But it is not always in your interest to disparage others in the process. So again, highlight where you may be different, but the attacks aren't as effective here. I'll just be honest. And I'm going to show a couple, not examples of attacks, but examples of how it can impact races. So one thing, this is a quote from the former mayor of Minneapolis who won a ranked choice voting election. She said, asking for a voter for a second choice is awkward. Asking a voter for a third choice is one of the most awkward things I've ever done. But after the third time I did it, I realized I was just a person trying to get to know my constituents and having conversations. And if I could get them to a third choice ask, it means we talked for a long time, right? So it's different. It's an adjustment. If there is one thing as a candidate I recommend practicing with friends and family, it's asking for a second choice, because it's going to be the newest thing for anybody who hasn't run in any election, but particularly in a ranked choice voting election before. That's the real adjustment. So a couple quick examples. These are a little bit small on the screen, and I'm going to go through it really quickly, but you as a candidate determine the tone of your campaign. It's from the top down. That's how it functions. It's your name on the ballot, and it's your campaign that's being run. And so the tone you set is important. So I'm not suggesting that you can never say anything about another candidate. If a candidate says or does something that totally violates your values and you feel you need to speak out, that is okay, but weighing those risks is really important. And you should have really clear guidelines for your staff, yourself, anybody associated with you in terms of how you're going to engage. One thing I want to highlight here is social media is where this gets just awful from time to time. And that's the hardest place to say, like, hey, this isn't how we engage in a campaign. But if you're really clear with your folks of what behavior is tolerated and what is not as a supporter, that's really important. So, avoiding anything ever personal, anything outside of what you actually want to criticize someone about, and keeping it to criticism, not attacks, is what I would recommend, because there are huge vote losing risks in going beyond that. So I'm going to focus on a couple of these. I wanted to give sort of a bipartisan example of the the places that we're talking about. So at the top here is a tweet saying, hey, looking at recent numbers and the tone of the campaign, I'm going to rank Maya Wiley number one as my first choice for mayor, and I will not be ranking these two other candidates, and I urge you to do the same. Now, I'm not saying this voter caused this situation below, but below I have the rounds of counting, and what we see is all of the candidates mentioned are still in the race. And the candidate that's eliminated could really have used the support from Andrew Yang, who was one of the people that this tweet said not to rank on your ballot. If we say not to rank you, your folks are probably not going to rank us, and this candidate really would have benefited from that. Granted, there were some policy positions that put folks further apart, but I'm just saying the idea of saying don't rank these people is not effective, especially when it could have helped the campaign if we could have found some common ground there. The other example I'm going to show is in Alaska, where this is New York's about as blue as it gets, and Alaska's relatively red. So these are different examples, but the same thing happening in two places. And that's where two Republican candidates just kept saying, hey, you need to drop out. No, you need to drop out. And somebody said, as Palin and Begich argue with each other, let's pretend that's what that blacked out word says, Peltola is going to coast. And what happened was, voters you would think of the same party would go together, but because these two candidates were arguing so much and were so negative with each other, the other candidate ran a campaign saying, hey, I like all Alaskans. I'm a candidate for all Alaskans. You don't have to feel bad voting for me because, I don't hate anybody. And it worked out really well for them. So it is not a tried and true thing. These are both very specific campaign examples, but it's something where thinking about ranked choice voting and how you campaign, and particularly if and when you are negative in your campaigning, can have real impact. And so I just want to highlight that. And we went through that much faster than I anticipated. So that is the end of my slideshow. So I'm going to stop sharing. And if there's any additional questions, we will answer those. Otherwise, we will get out of here quite early.
And for those in attendance, feel free to raise your hand and we can certainly answer question by, verbal questions too. The one important thing which I shared at the last election in 2022 is to share with your voter, remember fill in one oval per column per row. I know sometimes, the row, they may count it,
Mhm.
but if the voters remember one oval per column per row, it will help to make sure that the ballot will be valid.
Absolutely.
So it looks like we don't have any questions. This is the beginning of nomination season.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hopefully, we'll get more people interested and involved in the future series. And if any questions, like I said before, please email cityclerk@albanyca.org. And we will be updating information on our ranked choice voting city webpage, which is albanyca.org/RCV. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. And Grace, have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm sure we'll all be talking again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.